Hello and welcome to the Legacy Crusaders YouTube channel. This is Benji, and today we're going to talk about 5 tips that you can use in the draw phase. The first tip is going to be playing around Droll and Lockbird. If you're not familiar with Droll and Lockbird is a hand trap played in a lot of decks in formats where people do lots of searching. So the card's effect is if a card is added from your main deck to your opponent's hand except during the draw phase, which is a quick effect, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard, and for the rest of this turn, neither player can add cards from their deck to their hand. Now, some people don't know this, but there is a draw phase on the first turn of the duel. You can find it in the rulebook on page 35. Just to zoom in real quick. Important, the player who goes first cannot draw during the draw phase of their first turn, but there is a draw phase of the first turn. So one of the ways we play around Droll and Lockbird in the draw phase, trying to get more searches before they lock us out of adding cards from the deck from our deck to our hand, which they are going to do. That's what Droll does. If they have Droll and you add a card from your deck to your hand, they're going to activate Droll and Lockbird. But one of the things you can do is you can try to get some of your searches out during your turn, during your draw phase, with cards like Salamangrate Circle, and to add a Salamangrate card from your deck to your hand. Mostly the fact that it's a quick play allows you to activate it to get a card to your hand during the draw phase. You also most commonly currently as people are summoning Aluber, the Jester of Despia, from their hand using Branded Opening. So Branded Opening is a quick play card that allows you to special a Despia from your deck. So you special Aluber with your Branded Opening and use it to search for your Branded Fusion. Now, if you weren't aware of this, Master Hero Darklaw's effect, which says if a card is added from your deck to your hand, that it can activate to randomly banish a card from your hand, can't be used during the draw phase. It specifically says if your opponent adds a card from their deck to the hand, except during the draw phase or the damage step, you can banish one that they can banish one random card in your hand. So if you just add cards from your deck to your hand during the draw phase, you can avoid losing a card to Darklaw, at least a card at that particular moment, because Darklaw will still be live later in the turn. Same thing for Droll, but that is our first tip. Next, since we're talking about the draw phase, the first thing that happens in your draw phase is that you draw a card. So if you have no cards left in your deck, you actually deck out. And if you deck out, you lose. So one of the tips is to try and prevent yourself from going into your draw phase with no cards in your deck. So that means you can use card effects to try and put cards back into your deck. The best one for this is probably Cyphering Lord Omega. Reason being, if your deck has no cards in it and Cyphering Lord Omega is in the graveyard, you can use his graveyard effect, which is to return himself to the extra deck, as well as returning a card in either player's graveyard to the deck. So if you have no cards in your deck and you have Omega in your graveyard, you can activate Omega, return the best card in your deck to your graveyard, from your graveyard into your deck. That way, not only will you not deck out on the following turn, you'll be able to actively add any card from your deck to your hand, well, from your graveyard to your hand, by simply drawing it for a turn. Other cards that you might be playing in the meta that would be useful for avoiding deck out would be something like Prank Kids Pranks, which during the end phase of every turn allows you to shuffle 3 Prank Kids from your graveyard into your deck, and then you draw 1 card. Now, the one problem with this kind of effect, like Prank Kids Pranks or Pot of Avarice or Jar of Avarice or any card that return cards to the deck in order to draw a card, you can't use them if you have absolutely no cards in your deck. It's good for just making sure your deck doesn't run low on cards. The problem is, in order to activate and resolve these effects, you must have at least 1 card in your deck to draw a card. For Pot of Avarice, you need to have 2 cards in your deck in order to draw a card, because you can't activate the effect if you can't resolve the entire effect, and part of the effect of this card is to draw a card. So if there's no cards in your deck, you can't activate it to draw a card. Similarly, there are ways to prevent yourself from decking out using Cyphering Lord Omega with things like Nadir Servant and having Dogmatica cards, and you activate Nadir Servant, send Omega to the graveyard, then during the end phase you discard your Dogmatica card, use Omega to return your Nadir Servant to the graveyard, which puts Omega back in the extra deck, and you can kind of loop that forever and keep yourself from decking out. Next, our priority is going to be mostly for our Master Duelists out there, which is using Priority, because True King of All Calamities is still a legal card in Master Duel, and one of the ways to beat True King of All Calamities, which if you're not familiar with, is an extra deck monster who has a quick effect, which allows you to detach a material, call an attribute, and then your opponent's cards all become that attribute that are on the field, and cards that they possess, which is in their hand, their graveyard, everywhere, can't activate their effects. So most likely your opponent's just going to make it so you can't activate any effects. They'll just activate Calamities in the draw phase, call whatever they want. Usually they call something that matches a hand trap that you might be able to play afterwards, so that the cards in your hand and in your graveyard are also dead. But one of the ways to avoid losing to True King of All Calamities is to be proactive and invoke priorities. Now, priority says that the turn player at the start of any phase or step in the game has the option to do the first action. So if you start your draw phase and you have the ability to activate cards before your opponent. So the turn player always starts with priority or the choice to activate a card first. So during the draw phase, the first thing that happens is you draw a card, but following a draw of a card, which is a game mechanic, it's not an action that you really take. You have to do it at the start of the draw phase. which is why you deck out if you have no cards in your deck at the start of the draw phase, unless you can avoid drawing by either skipping your draw phase with cards like Reckless Greed or maybe doing something instead of a draw with a card like Legacy of the Duelist. But you have the first action. So the first action you're going to use, if possible, is to activate Super Polymerization to fuse away your opponent's True King of all Calamities into a Starving Venom Fusion Dragon, assuming they have a Dark Monster on the field during the draw phase, in addition to True King of all Calamities. And Super Polymerization is going to allow you to get rid of True King of all Calamities before it activates, because it has a lingering effect, and its linger effect will continue to affect you once it resolves. But Super Poly is a card they can't activate cards in response to. So by activating Super Polymerization, you can potentially get rid of the True King of all Calamities, while at the same time never allowing them to activate because it's your draw phase and you have priority. Next, we'll be talking about the most important part about tip for the draw phase, which is my favorite tip, is that the draw phase is before the standby phase. And most cards that resolve lingering effects or have conditions on them usually end or stop in the standby phase or the end phase. So most cards that have like costs or effects that resolve or linger for a while, they usually end until either the end of the turn, which is the end phase, or during the standby phase of the next turn. And standby phase takes place after the draw phase, and that's important, which means that if your opponent has a card like Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer and it's been destroyed during the previous turn and activated its effect, that means they'll be able to actually summon a Destiny Hero from the graveyard during the next turn. So you can simply get rid of it from the graveyard by activating a card like Hero of the Golden Land or Called by the Grave or DD Crow. Any of these things, you can do them during the draw phase to avoid your opponent bringing the card back. So just the fact that you have an entire phase to make actions and responses before your opponent can actually do something is something you should know, that the draw phase is ahead of the standby phase, and you should definitely take advantage of that. Another card that might come up during the standby phase is Doom King Ballardrock. Now, what Doom King Ballardrock does is, if it's in your graveyard during the standby phase, if it's in someone's graveyard during the standby phase and there's a field spell on the field, that player can activate its effect, which is to special summon it. So some players don't realize, oh wait, during the standby phase, I'm going to try and like DD Crow it, when you can just get rid of it before the standby phase during like the draw phase by like twin twistering their field spell, keeping them from having a field spell during the standby phase, or just like banishing it from the graveyard using Called by the Grave. Like, there's no reason to wait until the standby phase unless you can justify doing that, because if it's their turn, they have priority. So if you say, yeah, standby phase, no problem, they'll just say activate Doom King Ballardrock because they have priority to use the effect at the beginning of the standby phase. So there's no reason to purposely wait. So using your draw phase allows you to avoid any issues with priority of your opponent's turn, because again, priority belongs to the turn player, and your opponent will be the turn player of their turn. So during their standby phase, they'll be able to activate their Doom King or resolve their Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer. You have a little bit more leeway on your turn when you have priority, but there's no reason to wait purposely. So you just use your draw phase. It is ahead of your standby phase. Another type of card that might come up is the Dark Contracts. So if you're playing DDD and you play Dark Contracts during your standby phase, they might inflict 1,000 damage to your life points, and you could lose the duel. One of the things you can do is to try and remove it from the field. And rather than wait till the standby phase, where they have to activate, you can try and get rid of them beforehand. You could also resolve other effects during the standby phase first, and maybe get rid of your Dark Contracts in the standby phase, but why wait? You can get rid of them in the draw phase. You can use like Forbidden Droplet, sending them to the graveyard to maybe negate an opponent's card, or maybe Twin Twister them, just get them off the field so they're not there during the standby phase. And these are all things you can do during your draw phase, again, just to try and deal with this problem before it comes up. And the last tip is kind of relevant in the current format. A lot of people are playing Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer, and there is Destiny Hero Dasher is a card that you might see in your deck or on deck list, and it is a card that says once per duel, I believe. While this card's in your graveyard, and you draw, let me read the full effect, sorry. One time only, or once per duel is how we refer to it, is when you draw a monster card during your draw phase, while this card is in your graveyard, you can reveal it, special summon it, and this card must be in your graveyard to activate and resolve this effect. So what people are currently doing is, if you draw for turn and you shuffle your hand, you can't activate Dasher anymore. So one of the things you should be doing is being pretty careful to not immediately shuffle your hand once you draw a card, because there are a couple of cards that you have to activate at the start of the draw phase, and make sure that the card that you drew is clear as to what it is. So that is Destiny Hero Dasher if you draw a monster. A card like Palladium or Oracle Mahad is like a card that activates if you draw it for a turn. And then there's some other issues that can come up where your opponent might actually need to know which card is the card you drew for turn. So you want to be careful and not immediately shuffle your hand. If you shuffle your hand and they have this card, which is Drastic Drop-Off, you might have a problem, because Drastic Drop-Off is a card that says that when your opponent adds a card from the deck to the hand, including drawing them, they must discard those cards. So if you draw a card for turn and they were trying to activate drop off, and you can't discard the card, that's a problem. You need to be able to discard the card that you drew for turn. So if you shuffle your hand too quickly, that's a problem. But your opponent also has to be reasonable and alert you that they're going to activate this card. They can't just try and force a judge call on you and just say, oh, he shuffled his hand, I was going to use this card. You have to communicate with your opponent and make sure that everything's clear as to what's happening. So those are my 5 tips for the draw phase. If you have any questions or your own tips for the draw phase, please leave them in the comments below. There's a video here, and over there I usually have a recommended card. It recommends my ruling videos you might have seen in the past. Click here to subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the future. Have a great day, misplay less, and win more.